Ultimately, through the campaign, we champion trauma and equity-informed policies to ensure a healthy and just future for children, youth, and families in Virginia. This week, you will have the opportunity to access and actively participate in a variety of offerings across 4 areas: diversity, equity, and inclusion, community-centered engagement, advocacy and activism, and policy, equity, and data analysis. We hope you will avail yourself of this opportunity and visit those workshops that spark your interest. For now, on behalf of Voices, I welcome you to Virginia's 2nd Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, August 22nd through the 28th. I am personally happy to kick off the week with our first event and guest, William Martin, Director of the Valentine. Today, Bill will lead us on a virtual tour of Richmond City, including the neighborhoods surrounding downtown, Barton Heights, Jackson Ward, Maymont, Oregon Hill, and parts of Southside. This tour will highlight some of the demographic and social changes that these areas of the city have and are experiencing, and to explore the historic origin of these changes. I'm excited Bill will be leading us through this virtual event. In addition to being director of the Valentine, he leads over 50 museum staff members in telling the story of Richmond lifestyle and culture. For more than 20 years, Bill has diversified the Valentine's programming, expanded Richmond walking tours and group tours, and worked collaboratively in the community to promote city tourism initiatives. Bill holds a BA in Urban Studies and an MA in Public Administration from Virginia Tech. Following years of experience directing museums in Georgia, Florida, and Virginia, he joined the then Valentine Museum in 1993 as Director of Marketing and Public Relations. Under his leadership, the institution has expanded civic involvement, developed more than 300 themed tours, and raised millions of dollars for capital improvements, renovated historic structures, and expanded programming. Bill serves as on the board of directors of the Richmond Business Council and Leadership Metro Richmond. He chairs the Richmond Region Museum Directors and is a member of the Richmond Mayor's Tourism Commission. Bill has been actively involved in community conversations about social issues and cultural enrichment, and recently collaborated with many educators and scholars to create a downtown heritage walking trail, the Liberty Trail, which joins the Richmond Slave Trail. Before joining the Valentine, Bill was the Director of Tourism and Museums for the City of Petersburg, Virginia, Executive Director of Jacksonville Museum of Arts and Science in Florida. For now, I will turn over to Bill to lead us through this virtual walking experience. And before I do that, Bill, thank you again for joining us and being part of this special week.
It is great to be here and great to be back. This is important. I think the first of anything is important, but the second event, the second time you do something, is even more important because it establishes a tradition that provides continuing awareness of the community of the issues that are so important to our city. And so welcome to this. This is a driving tour, and it will be downloadable. I think you can see the map on your screen now, and we will just do a quick walkabout. But you know, we have to start, I'm afraid, because I'm at the Valentine, our drive today really has to start at the Valentine, in this really unique place in the middle of the city, in a neighborhood called Court End. This neighborhood developed very early on, and its history is a fascinating one in its own right. We're a block away from the Capitol, and yet this was a neighborhood where all the powerful lawyers, attorneys, and others who were going to be working in the Capitol moved. And so you have wealthy slaveholders who are lawyers and others building houses in this neighborhood because both of its proximity to the Capitol, but I would suggest its proximity to Shockoe Bottom and the center of the domestic slave trade. And so this location of power in the middle of the city, close to the Capitol, is really a fascinating place to start our tour. And we, in addition to the Wickham House, which we will see a bit of, we also know that John Marshall lived here. And we know that Brockenborough, who built the White House of Confederacy, was here also. And so we can see who was living here as an indicator of the neighborhood and its importance, but we can also see that this neighborhood transformed quickly into the medical center. And so as we start our tour, we're going to go through a number of neighborhoods today. And the first neighborhood, as we move out of, you can see the John Marshall House, is that you can see a neighborhood that is completely under construction at this point. You can see the old public health and safety building. You can see the construction of the new outpatient care building. This neighborhood is now being transformed, and many folks remember this project was known as Navy Hill. While Navy Hill itself did not happen, many of the elements related to the Navy Hill neighborhood are. And so you see additional blocks being dedicated to public health, apartments, and a variety of other things without the development of the Coliseum element of it. So it's an interesting thing where a larger proposal was put into smaller pieces and is now being developed across the city. And again, destroying the history of a neighborhood, and I think there's still opportunities to tell that story, but oh my gosh, what a change in this neighborhood is proceeding even without the named project Navy Hill. But Navy Hill has its own history. Has its own history. How did it get its name? Well, we forget that the War of 1812, yeah, we're going to go way back in history. The War of 1812 had a profound effect on Richmond. We sent lots of soldiers to serve in that war. It was the Second War of American Independence. And when the war was over, what do we do in Richmond? We love a monument. And so this neighborhood, which was really undeveloped at that point, was going to be the center of a monument to the naval heroes of the War of 1812. And while the neighborhood didn't develop, it initially developed as a German neighborhood and then ultimately transitioned to principally an African-American neighborhood even before the Civil War. So there were these independent communities like Jackson Ward, like Navy Hill, that were beginning the sense of creating a sense of place in a place that was not welcoming to Black folk. And so these neighborhoods began to develop in the periphery around downtown, and those are the ones that we see today. Now, for folks who know me, they know that I am kind of obsessed about cemeteries, and we're going to see a lot of cemeteries along the way. The first one we'll see is the one that's in the far right corner, and this is Hebrew Cemetery. One of the interesting demographics of Richmond is that in its early founding, because we had the Statute for Religious Freedom, we attracted a large variety of religious belief to Richmond, from early Baptist communities to early Jewish communities, Presbyterians, Methodists. All of those dissenting churches, Protestant churches, found a welcoming place in Richmond because of the Statute of Religious Freedom. And this is reflected across the city in many other cemeteries and other places across the city. So we're going to keep driving because as many of you know, I also love Northside, and I particularly think there are important stories to tell in both Highland Park and Barton Heights, but we have a little while to get there. The brick building in the top left is the Alms House. This building, built in 1860, was built to house Richmond's poor white community. Across the street was a similar alms house for poor Blacks in the city. That location is now the location of Hebrew Cemetery, the cemetery we just saw. More interesting is, and many of you have heard in recent years about where this gas station is. This gas station sits on Second African Burial. It's been called a number of different things. But under this gas station are potentially 18,000 African-American graves. We know in the 1930s that this entire section of the city was disrupted, new roads placed in, new bridges placed in the neighborhood. And so only recently, and can you believe that? Yes, you can. only recently can we understand the importance of the connectivity of these cemeteries. So you have Hebrew Cemetery, you have Shaco Cemetery, which is where John Marshall is buried, and across the street, in a building that was a gas station, and a building that was an animal control building for the city. The pound for the city is also located on this property. Property's been recently purchased by the city, and so you can see that this is a complicated history, and we'll take the bridge over, and we find ourselves what older Richmonders will know as Dove Court, one of those incidences of redevelopment of housing communities. But there's something interesting in this redevelopment. Look closely. There are no back doors to any of these units, which means that no backyards, no green space, that in fact, the construction of these buildings says a lot about what the builders thought about who might live there, right? That only back doors would allow people to escape if someone was coming in. But think about having a family in this building and being on the second floor of a building, and there's a fire. I think that how we build says so much about how we perceive people and how we begin to think about housing in this city, not as these cluster developments that don't really respect the humanity of the people that are living there, is fascinating to me. It's also fascinating, and you're going, what's a church doing here? Well, the church is St. Elizabeth's Catholic Church. Highland Park was the original Little Italy for Richmond. In 1890, the trolleys came to Richmond, and the trolleys extended out from downtown into the suburbs, into the counties. And when the Italians arrived, they were recruited really to build the cathedral, to set the tile, the stone, all of those things for the building of the cathedral. When they finished that construction, they were essentially told, thank you, this Catholic church is really not for you. They tried to go to St. Patrick's Church in Churchill, and it is recorded that the Irish members of St. Patrick's sent a petition to the bishop really requesting that no Italians attend their church. And so ultimately they tried in a small Catholic church in Jackson Ward, which was German, and ultimately found themselves building their own church in St. Elizabeth's in Highland Park. And again, the importance and the change of neighborhoods due to migration in the city is one that is fascinating to me. And it's also fascinating to me that these neighborhoods get fixed in place in the 20th century because of redlining and Jim Crow policies that fix these neighborhoods in their place until these laws are loosened in the 1960s and 70s. School integration, particularly in Highland Park, the Italian community within a decade in Highland Park, this neighborhood went from essentially 100% white to 100% African American. 1 decade, totally tied to school integration and the fear of integrating schools. We can see certainly that this neighborhood now is changing rapidly. I always say that you've got a kombucha store, a tattoo parlor, and an art gallery. I think those are indicators of changing demographics in a neighborhood. And I think that there's a lot of research to be done, I think, about the redevelopment of these retail strips. What's the opportunities for Black business on these retail strips as they redevelop? And what are the opportunities for them? But as you can see, these neighborhoods along Brooklyn Park Boulevard at Six Picks all the way along are changing and changing rapidly as the demographics around the neighborhood are changing. When it comes to demographics, I think we do need to unpack, as John Meeser would say, the new census, because I think the new census is very revealing about what's happening in Richmond's neighborhoods. You can see neighborhoods like this one that were majority Black, transitioning to majority white neighborhoods. You can see the population of the city. It's a majority minority city. Most people know that, but the numbers are pretty astounding. It's essentially 40% Black, 40% white, and then both Latino and Asian populations have grown within the city. And so the city has a very interesting demographic, but the fact is that the largest group within the city is the white population. And that is, you can see that within the last census, the last decade. And how does that change our neighborhoods? Are there policies that need to be in place? How do we change public policy to address those kind of fundamental changes in the social structure of the city? We cannot go on Brooklyn Park Boulevard without stopping at Richmond Community High. This amazing place, when it was originally, and we can actually zoom in on it, it was Chandler Junior High School. And this became the first school to be integrated in the city. And the integration was interesting because it was affluent, middle-class Black kids from Barton Heights and a similar demographic of white kids from Genter Park. So that you had, this integration of schools, but as we talked earlier, it wasn't going to happen with Highland Park kids. The Highland Park kids, there was open resistance to integration, and that neighborhood changed. And so often when we talk about history, we talk about the Civil War in Richmond, and why don't we make this moment an important one too? Little Rock has built an entire story for their community around this period in Virginia history and American history. Why doesn't Richmond seize the opportunity to tell these stories too? I think it's very telling what stories are missing. And I think we can see it in our neighborhoods across the city. We're continuing on. We're going back through Jackson Ward. Before we go any further, are there any questions? I'm really talking too fast and I'm not seeing any comments, so I'm really worried.
Hi, Bill. There's one question where it's asked, is Highland Park where Boaz and Ruth is? There was also another comment. Allison said her dad grew up in Highland Park and never knew that history. So thankful that you're sharing it.
Boaz and Ruth is in the Highland Park neighborhood. That's also where Storefront for Community Design has its outpost. There are a number of organizations that are there. It's also where we can see a lot of change otherwise. Yeah, it's a really fascinating story because I'd love for us to take there are some particular neighborhoods that I would love to take a house and just take that one house and look at all the people that have lived in that house. I'd love to take one of the units in, Gilpin Court and actually look at who has lived in that unit over time. Those early residents, what happened to those early residents? I think that there's an opportunity to look at individual spots like a Highland Park or Barton Heights or a Gilpin Court and be able to look at the family stories, because these are not just buildings. There are these important family stories that are embedded there that we kind of ignore. Not kind of ignore, we ignore. And so I'm just fascinated by them. I love, a year ago, I'm sorry, First African Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church is a fascinating story of race and its interconnectedness to religion in Richmond. The First Baptist Church is established downtown Richmond, Broad Street, on a corner of College and Broad. This church is racially integrated, not in a weird way, separate seating areas, all of those things that we would expect. But the church did exist as a integrated congregation. 1800, we see that the Baptist Church, as many things do, the issues around slavery and enslavement hardened, and the Baptist church, like the Methodists, like the Presbyterians, all separate and divide over the issue of the church's stand on race and slavery. In Richmond, the First Baptist Church builds a building just a block away up the street and builds their church, and First African remains in their congregation until they both move towards their constituencies. So First Baptist moves with its white congregation to Monument Avenue, and First African Baptist Church moves to Barton Heights, where by this point, Barton Heights had transitioned from that Italian neighborhood. Early on, by the way, in 1942, the first African American moves into Barton Heights, and it becomes the place for doctors, lawyers, professors. That North Street, the avenue, was the center of Black shopping. And so I always say that North Avenue is the equivalent of Libyan Grove today in terms of really amazing shopping focused with Black-owned businesses on Black residents of that neighborhood. Really a story, again, no one's heard about those businesses on North Avenue. And the fact in this collection, we have a dress made by one of the dressmakers there from someone who had gone to the Millen Roads downtown, was not allowed to try a dress on. She took a picture and brought it back to the seamstress on the avenue and had the exact same dress made with probably better quality. So these stories exist and exist right in front of us. These buildings are still there. We can also see that we're looking along the way at Gilpin Court. We know that Gilpin Court has multiple phases of development. And we can see certainly those phases along the way. But as we cross that bridge into Gilpin Court, we also see St. Luke's. And these buildings exist together. And do we talk about the way they're on the same side of the interstate? St. Luke's is an important place where the center of Black enterprise and the Order of St. Luke and the Penny Savings Bank and retail started by the Order of St. Luke and printing presses and insurance companies, all located in Jackson Ward in that period after the Civil War in those 1890s on, when Richmond divided itself socially, politically, culturally around race. And that remains really on the ground today that we see. Amazing things exist in our neighborhoods. And so we have the Black History Museum, this armory building constructed again after the Civil War. Wasn't a real armory, people with guns. There were these social organizations that existed. There were a number of armories, both white and Black, during the years after the Civil War. But again, in the 1890s, these became places for people to socialize, to organize, to have discussions about their communities. Churches, armories, men's and women's social clubs become the center of organizing and a central way for Black communities and white communities to maintain their cultural life in spite of the barriers that had been set up across the city. I'm going to keep rolling. I've got some really great pictures of Maggie Walker. Oh, there she is. She's in her bank. And these are pictures, one taken there, but also we have a picture outside of, oh gosh, brain just went. Who's on the call that can help me? Six Mount Zion, Six Mount Zion Church. So again, centers of life in Jackson Ward, churches, social organizations, and banks. These institutions survive until the 1960s, because of in many ways, because of integration and the ability to shop in regular places, to cross Broad Street and shop in the Millen Roads and Tallheimers. Many people took the preference of shopping in white-owned businesses on the other side of the street. And so somehow this notion of how do we reknit our communities back with Black business is really, I think, a critical element as we see, because we can see what happened because of the construction of I-95. We're looking across, we can see Gilpin. We can see in the black and white picture, we can see a 6 Mount Zion church, and we can see the Maggie Walker, the Order of St. Luke. One of the weirdest things I think in history was the route of I-95. I-95 was moved just a little bit because it was originally positioned to take down 6 Mount Zion Church. And so there was a bit of accommodation, but nothing can deny how this highway happened. The city of Richmond on multiple occasions, the city government of Richmond voted on multiple occasions not to permit the construction of I-95. And to get around city council and the political will of the city, an organization called the Richmond Metropolitan Authority was established that allowed a super board with extra governmental responsibilities and powers like the right of condemnation to take down entire parts of the city without state funding, without city funding, based on tolls that would be collected. And so what you see is that construction in 1957, 10% of Richmond's African-American community lost their houses during this construction. And then we kind of continue to drive. You know, we have Virginia Union University, Maggie Walker. You know, and when we talk about Maggie Walker, which was a Black high school, you know, what happens to the school today? It's a magnet school for the region. But are Black kids welcome there? And I think we know that there have been challenges, fairly public challenges, about the distribution and student body of the school. So how does a school that is dedicated to this commitment of creating a socially diverse population, how does it do that? And why do Black kids in Richmond public schools prefer to go to community high than to go to Maggie? Really important questions that need to be addressed if we're going to actually have long-term impact. Certainly Virginia Union. But what is fascinating, I don't know if anyone on the tour today can explain to me, because I just don't get it. I don't think anyone can explain to me Scott's Addition. I mean, I can explain it, but to me, it's just the strangest place. I'm not sure why people, I mean, there are no sidewalks, there's not great lighting, the parking is challenging, and yet it is one of the fastest growing, and as you can see from the construction photographs, fastest growing areas of the city. One of the reasons that it happened is actually tax policy, and tax policy related to preservation and preservation tax credits. Preservation tax credits allowed basically this entire portion of the city to be designated a historic district. Within that historic district were numbers of buildings that met the basic age requirements, 50 years or older, so that warehouses became eligible for both federal, state, and city tax credits related to their preservation. And so what you find in this neighborhood and across the city is that using historic preservation tax credits, neighborhoods such as Manchester, Churchill, Scott's Addition, and others have been transformed in downtown to a certain extent by the use of historic preservation tax credits, which essentially subsidize the construction of these neighborhoods and create this density that's not what was the original density of the neighborhood. I always have to include Boca because it's one of the weirder, former porn store, now taco place. It's amazing what tax credits will do for you. Sorry, it's Sunday afternoon and it's what I have to do. We continue on Arthur Ashe Boulevard, taking ourselves out of, and where do we find ourselves? Where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves crossing Monument Avenue. And Do we want to talk a bit about Monument Avenue? Normally what I do is, because we spend so much time in Richmond talking about monuments and Monument Avenue, that I usually just go enough with the Civil War. But I do think that it's worth it to spend a moment talking about Monument Avenue's development. We were talking about that 1890 period, right? In Virginia's history and Richmond's history. There's that early period, Constitution, Jefferson, all of those folks, Gabriel. And then we have a second period after the Civil War that I think in many ways has more informed who we are as a city today than anything before. And it's called the Lost Cause, Jim Crow era. It really begins with a critical election in 1888. Prior to 1888, there was a political party called the Readjuster Party. And I'm going to challenge you to do your homework, a little extra reading. Look up the Readjuster Party in Richmond, in Virginia. It's a progressive party that controls the state for a little over a decade. It elects African Americans to Congress, to our legislature. A majority of city council in Richmond were members of the Readjuster Party. It was a party composed of freedmen, a group of Confederate generals, and there were actually still Republicans in the city who created this party. That party essentially ends with the election in 1888. And from 1888, we see the transformation of Virginia's political environment, social environment that reflects really the issues today. So 1888, guess what gets designed? Monument Avenue. Monument Avenue cuts through existing neighborhoods and begins to develop a portion of the city that it was based on these amazing designs that people had seen in other cities. You go to Paris, you see these broad boulevards, this is a very popular design element that many cities do during this period. The design is interesting because we actually have the original design for Monument Avenue. And I will tell you that when it was designed, there were no other monuments with the exception of Lee. And Lee stands as the only monument on Monument Avenue for 20 years. While monuments go up across the city after 1890, it really wasn't until the early 20th century that monuments began to be inserted. And if you notice, all the monuments that are the city-owned ones, not the state-owned ones, all seem to be sort of dropped in the middle of intersections. And there's a reason, because those intersections were never intended for monuments. But we also see in the 1890s the development of a lot of things we know today. The Commonwealth Club. We see the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Valentine Museum, the Museum of the Confederacy, Evergreen Cemetery, the emergence of Penny Savings Bank, the development of this entire world of separation that emerges. And those laws become more and more and more entrenched. And as the confidence builds, I think so does the confidence to build additional monuments on Monument Avenue. And that's how we get them. And so I'm not going to spend, again, a lot of time, but if we think about this neighborhood essentially was dedicated to the preservation of Confederate memory. The United Daughters of the Confederacy. You've got the amazing transformation of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. 1936, when it opens, it had very interesting policies about its own admissions. Next door, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture was built as Battle Abbey, a temple to the Confederacy. Certainly major transformation there. You also see some other monuments along our trek. There's Columbus without Columbus. Now, okay, you're going to say, I think you're obsessed, Bill, with Italians. I just think it's an interesting story. So why in the heck is there a Columbus monument in Richmond, Virginia? Why is that? Easy. 1920s. In addition to the rise of racism in the South, in the country, we also see the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, the rise of a variety of, you can name the group, anti-Semitism. The 1920s saw this rise of anti-Semitism that ends really, well, not ends, but is sort of embodied in the 1924 restrictions on immigration, not unlike the restrictions on immigration today. And so for folks that had an ethnic identity, Italian, French, whatever your ethnic identity was, you knew that you wanted to make sure that people understood that so there's a great book out called When Did Italians Become White? Or is it, and it's, again, it's sort of becoming white. And so part of this was Columbus, the Italians placing this monument to establish their credibility in the community and their identity in the community as they saw it fading. We also see the Carillon. And the Carillon for me is this interesting signal because it was built for World War I, but World War I, we don't have a military monument, do we? We don't have a military monument because the Valentine family actually stopped the construction of this monument because it was going to be one of the folks fighting soldiers. And the intent was to create something that wasn't about war, but was to remember the dead and dying and to mark the mourning and loss. We're going to keep going, but it also is interesting to know that the Carillon neighborhood was one of the first intentionally integrated communities in Richmond. This neighborhood was redlined, and to fight back against redlining, the neighborhood began to take advertisements in the want ads and the real estate ads. And also, while we enjoy arts in the park today, guess why we have arts in the park? It was because this neighborhood wanted to signal that the neighborhood was open to everyone. And so Arts in the Park's legacy is from this amazing group of leaders in the Carillon neighborhood who sought to build a different kind of community. There's the Carillon neighborhood, but we continue. We're going to have to move quickly. I will say that we're not going into Hollywood Cemetery, but I will say that one of my most favorite entrances is the color photograph at the center bottom. You really can't see it too well, but next to Hollywood Cemetery, there are two other cemeteries. One is Riverview, and the other is Mount Calvary. One is for all the rest of us. Mount Calvary is for Catholics. So is it nice to know that there are two entrances to heaven? I'm sorry, I'm being irreverent, but we'll keep moving. But the fact is that, even in death, there are these visible signals of who goes where. And there are no, African-American, well, there are now African-American burials in these cemeteries. Even in death, there were separations based on faith traditions across the city. Now we got to keep moving because we need to make sure we get across the river. Yes, South Side does exist. For old Richmonders, South Side is not a place that you even know exists. And yet it was added to the city in 1910 as part of not an annexation, but a consolidation. This neighborhood, and we're looking at the Sacred Heart Center, which is a great place that provides a variety of services to Richmond Latinx community. What's interesting, the neighborhood around this building has already changed, and there's construction everywhere. And while the demographics of the city are changing pretty dramatically, you have multiple elementary schools in this neighborhood where over 90% of the students are Spanish speaking, which makes traditional ESL programs very difficult. You have the junior high school, Bashal, at about 40% of Spanish speaking. You see concentrations of Spanish speaking Latinx folks all along Jeff Davis. and Hall Street. And so this is one of the changing demographics. And for many people that live on the traditional side of the river, this part of development is changing without many people understanding the significance, the long-term significance of this to the city. I do have some fun photographs of Hall Street in the annexation. At least Hall Street got paved. But also the courthouse and the banner celebrating the annexation of the city. But when we think about housing challenges, we have to understand the dynamics of housing in the South Side, which have really not been described and really not researched the way it should be, and the impact. We're looking at Jeff Davis. We can certainly see that for many Richmonders, we need to see that mobile homes are a principal way of low-cost housing for many Richmonders. These are aging complexes with aging buildings, and have become a focus of certainly some redevelopment activity. The question is, what happens when a trailer park, mobile home park is closed? What do we, how do we deal with the displacement of these solid communities that in many ways are more solid neighborhoods than many others in the city? And what happens when they are taken down and you see there's significant construction on the South Side, and then you see Hillside Court. Hillside Court was a public housing community for whites initially. So these were folks that were working in factories in the South Side, out the Reynolds Metals plant and tobacco plants. So there was in fact a parallel universe even within public housing. And then Ancaro's Landing, this amazing spot where we know, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the slave trade, but we know that Ancaro's Landing, the Manchester docks, were an integral part of this intricate web of the landscape of slavery in Richmond. We'll talk about it in a little bit, I promise. Because we're going to cross the bridge, I'm sorry we're not spending much time in Manchester, but this view is fascinating to me. This is looking, we're in Shockoe Bottom, we're not very far from Bottoms Up Pizza. And this street is looking from the river, looking through to the river, all the way through. And this street, 15th Street, would have been the center of the domestic slave trade. We know that it was about this location that Lincoln would have entered the city at the end of the Civil War. And if you look under the bridge, you can actually look all the way through and see the area where Lumpkin's jail is. The geography of this space has been totally destroyed, so that the visual connections between the river, this connection to the river, this collection of buildings that serve the domestic slave trade has been totally lost, in sharp contrast to our memorialization of other parts of Richmond's history. So this view is really, I think, important to us in understanding just the magnitude of the slave trade in Richmond. And the slave trade in Richmond was a domestic one. I think that somehow, I don't know where the narrative emerged, but for Richmond, it's a very different story. Richmond was not the international trade. There's very little evidence of any direct ships coming with enslaved people to Richmond for sale. We were actually, I think, something much more insidious from my perspective, is that we were taking families, intergenerational families. Remember, the slave trade is a long period. It's 1600s, 1700s. So you've got 100, 150, 125 years of enslaved people in community, not traded significantly. And then with the emergence of cotton in the Deep South, these families, these units of people that have been living together marriage, all those things are in Richmond, Virginia, split and sold. These are multi-generational families that are in many cases have been in this country longer than those that are selling them.
Hey, Bill.
And that happens, and the magnitude is the magnitude of these sales are kind of crazy. So when we think about this trade, how many people were enslaved and brought into North America? That number, while it varies in estimates, is somewhere between 350 and 500,000 people. 8 million are more into Central and South America, but to North America, between 350 and 500,000 people. How many people are sold out of Richmond in the years before the Civil War? Between 350 and 500,000 people are sold out of the city, whether they were on existing plantations and farms, or whether they were being bred for sale in farms around the city. That's the magnitude. And what you see is actually a rare object in our collection, Lumpkin's slave jail ledger. This is really a rare document that shows the sale of African Americans out of Shaka Bottom, and from a site that we know where it was. Guys, I'm going all over again. Any questions?
Yeah, Bill, there's a few questions. I wanted to see how you would, what your preference was. We have a few related to specific comments on here. So do you mind if I take a moment?
That's fine. Absolutely. Sorry. I just roll.
No, that's okay. And Leslie, feel free to take yourself off mute if you want to ask these questions too. I'll start with your first one. She asks, and I apologize, I don't know what slide this was associated with.
Okay.
Is this where the Museum of Enslaved People will be?
The Museum of Enslaved People will be actually in Shako Bottom. Actually, when you're looking at that street, it will be really at the end of the street by Main Street Station.
So it's not at the end, like you showed us down that roadway and you said under the bridge was the Lumpkin jail.
Right, it'll be under the bridge on that other side. Again, that's a different perspective. We normally see Lumpkin's jail from either Main Street or Broad Street.
Uh-huh.
And that perspective of the interconnectedness of that site to the auction houses, to the river, I think is really important.
Yeah. And so you say most of the slaves that were sold were ones that were raised here in Virginia, were born and bred in Virginia, but then when tobacco started to decline, they needed
the decline of tobacco and the demand for gang slavery in the Deep South for both cotton. The soil had really worn out. Virginia's economy was in steep decline in the years before the Civil War, the agricultural economy. And so that what you did have in Richmond was the industrial use of enslaved people. And so, we always think about agricultural. What we don't think about is the urban. What did urban slavery look like? And so you had many people in Richmond who had large numbers of enslaved people, not doing certainly doing some of the domestic work, but were being hired out to work in factories, to work in mills, so that the hiring out is something that there's a lot of research emerging now, lots of people doing great research, because urban slavery is such a different animal than the agricultural. And in Richmond, we really do begin to use every technology possible to do. We use industry, but we also, one of the things that most people don't think about is Richmond was one of the first places to have steam trains, locomotives. And so there was a train station located right where the Federal Reserve building is. And if you go down to the river and you see a set of stone pilings going across the river into Manchester, what you'll find is that's this train station where folks sold in Shockoe Bottom were being loaded onto cars there and being trained. You know, we certainly talk about down the river, those kinds of sales, but in Richmond, they were using every new technology possible to speed up this industry.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
And that's the only 2 comments right now, or questions, and then there's some comments that we can address at the end.
Okay, whatever we'd like to do. I'm trying to get us home. I really am. Again, we can see sort of the changes in Shockoe Bottom. Main Street Station, look at that date. It's 1890, right? 1890, the economy of Richmond transforms. It is boom time for cigarette manufacturing. It's when banks, insurance companies, all of these institutions that exist, that were some of them based on their economic advantage during the Civil War, who grow, but also new entrepreneurs, folks that become the sort of elite. This is a period of great wealth and great expansion of wealth. So you have people like the Dooleys and the Genters and the Bryans, all these families that become part of an industrial elite that you see in cities. It's the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age comes to Richmond, and it comes it builds the kinds of buildings that we see in the bottom. Now we're going to try to keep going. I promise. We're going to move along the river again to see how places have been repurposed. Capitol Trail and Low Line, the Canal Walk. As we continue to move through the city, we can see that how spaces that had been abandoned are being reclaimed. Spaces with deep history are being reclaimed, and at least with the Capitol Trail, the organization has attempted to mark where Lincoln entered the city. And again, that's one of the stories that wasn't really told in Richmond. Because how could Lincoln have ever come here? Well, he came up from what was then City Point, now Hopewell, came up with his son on a little raft. They get trapped on a sandbar in the river. They come across the river on this little pedestrian bridge. And I always tell kids that I'm with, they come out at bottoms up pizza. Because I want kids to remember. I want kids to remember where these events occur. There's no protective patrol to meet him. And he simply walks through the city unprotected from that location. Imagine being someone who had just received that physical evidence of their freedom. What that experience would have been, what it would have been like to be that person who had been a slave holder, and to see that part of your life go. I mean, there's that sort of conflict would have been so fascinating to get into people's heads during that period. Would be something that would be an amazing sort of maybe some help for us today as we deal with the complex issues. We can also see that the farmers market has undergone many transformations in Shockoe Bottom. From the first market building, there's actually one before that. But again, this evolution of powerful spaces, and how do we use them today? And how do we acknowledge the events that occurred there? And then we get to Shockoe Bottom itself. Devil's Half Acre, the burial ground, Lumpkin's Jail, the building, the small patch of grass you see with the 3 plaques is the site of Lumpkin's Jail. It's on a floodplain. It floods regularly. Again, you put the sort of things that you don't mind losing on a floodplain. You build around it. You build a highway over it. We know that the majority of the auction houses and much of the burial ground are not visible. They're actually all under I-95. There was this intent, this removal and covering of history is something that is up to us now to begin to dig, all of us, to begin to dig and recover and discover, because this story, the story of this parking lot, is one for the country and for the world to understand what happened in Richmond, Virginia, the great ideas that emerged from here, and the great injustices that are. So it's just, again, this community schizophrenia that is an important one to mention and to acknowledge and to learn from. You can see that here's an early Jewish cemetery on Shockoe Bottom, just a block or two away from the bottom itself. And what's fascinating to me is just 3-4 blocks away, you have these great public parks. You have these amazing spaces for things to happen. And you have places like St. John's Church. So, how crazy is it when we think about St. John's Church, that when Patrick Henry and the crew escaped to Richmond, Richmond had 600, 800 people in it. It was a place they went to hide so that no one else could know their meeting. This was not a big place. And for that cry of liberty and death to be mirrored just a few years later by Gabriel, death or liberty. These contrasting and in many ways similar ideas about the human spirit, about what is liberty, what is freedom. How can we be at St. John's Church and understand that 3 blocks away we had Shockoe Bottom, Devil's Half Acre? How can we understand that just a block away, really a block up the hill from Shockoe Bottom, is the executive mansion for the state and the state capitol? How do we understand these things and put them in context, and how do we use them to create this something we want to be? How do we create a voice? How do we create a voice for these untold stories? And so we're going to head back now. I've gone on way too long, and I'm already being told I'm like way over time. When we think about Churchill, though, we also have to think about some of the changes here. Think about all the restaurants that have come in. Why did those restaurants come to Churchill? What do we see in terms of changes in population in Churchill? Dramatic shifts in population that we're seeing across the city, whether it's Manchester, whether it's Highland Park, Barton Heights. Shifts that are occurring across the city that are, what is our response as a community? And I think that is the challenge for voices, really, to be a voice for how do we bring the people's voice back into the things that are going on within the city. And I think we can, and I think that history does provide opportunities for that. But we can't forget what happened last year. We can't forget what happened in our community and communities across the country as advocates brought clearly to our attention and to the world's attention the injustices of the long-term injustices of our community. And here's our opportunity. And here's our opportunity. In those vacant spots, those unused stores, what do we do? I think we know what we can do. And so I'm going to say we finally made it home, and I'm sure you're just like so relieved. We made it back. But any questions, comments? I love your comments because that's how we get these things going.
Yeah, and I'm going to say thank you so much, Bill, for walking us through that amazing presentation. One of my comments was that I have lived here for 10 years and I didn't know most of that history, and that I'm a little embarrassed about how little I knew. So thank you so much for taking the opportunity to just educate us on everything that is Richmond. I think that is so important. We have a couple of questions. Kathy, I know you had a comment, so I want to give you the first opportunity to speak if you'd like to take yourself off mute. And then I will open up the floor for others to ask questions. And we're good on time right now. So
We are good on time, but I just want to make sure that we did have some time for questions, because
Yeah.
that's where the good stuff happens.
Yes, that sounds good. Kathy, do you want to take yourself off? It's okay, I can read her comment. Her comment was a book by, and I would not be able to pronounce the first name, Johnson. Yellow Wife does a wonderful job of helping one understand just how insidious Lumpkin's jail really was. I don't know if anyone's ever seen or heard of that book.
It's really an amazing book. It focuses on Richmond, and if you've not read it, it should be on your, I guess we can't do beach reading anymore, but I think it should be on your reading list for the fall.
Yeah.
It is a remarkable description.
Yeah, this is Kathy. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Sorry, it took me a minute.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah, I had no idea about Lumpkin's jail until after reading that book. And I know it's fiction, but you can tell Sadiqa did a lot of research to describe the kind of things that happened there. So it gives you, I felt like I was there. I could not put the book down. So it's part of history that's painful, but I think it helps everybody to understand what really happened.
Are there any other comments or questions? Yeah, Leslie, go ahead.
I have a lot of questions.
Go ahead.
So, Bill, thank you so much for doing this. I've only been in Richmond 3 years, so but I'm very interested in this. You know, as you were talking about, I don't know all the areas you talked about, but you talked about Highland Park, which at one time was a very affluent neighborhood, and then it came into.
Well, Highland Park is an interesting one because it was never an affluent neighborhood. It was an Italian working class neighborhood.
And that's where they built their church, but then
that's where they built their church, and there was core businesses. You know, it was also during Prohibition, and so there's some really great stories. We've been doing some recording of oral histories from that neighborhood, and there's some really, really great stories about how many grapes they grew in the neighborhood, and they would have wine competitions in the park there. So sort of romantic views of what life was like, but certainly we all, when we think about our childhoods and family, have those great memories. But it was never an upper class neighborhood. It was always working class. Mm-hmm. The differences in Barton Heights, and what's interesting is they are the exact same. They're a hill apart, a valley apart. It had, because it was on a different trolley line.
Interesting.
So there was a trolley line to Barton Heights. There was a trolley line to Highland Park that came downtown. Oh. Uh-huh. And so in many ways, the trolley lines, where you lived and who you were determined what you could tell by which trolley line you were taking home at the end of the day. And so there's a trolley line that went out to the West Hampton, to University of Richmond that way. There's one that went out to Lewis Skinner Botanical Gardens. There was the one that went to Forest Hill Park across on the South Side. And each of these neighborhoods had their own distinct economic, ethnic breakdowns that I think we always think about. So, I mean, the line to Highland Park was the Italians. The Barton Heights, and the thing with Highland Park, it remains Italian really into the 60s. This thing that happens in Barton Heights is very different, is that many people that were living in Jackson Ward understood that the highway was going to be built. These were professors and doctors and others who were moving out of Jackson Ward and moving to Barton Heights, great houses, and certainly, great elementary schools. I mean, the schools were really important to the folks that were moving into Barton Heights. So you have the first Black woman professor from Virginia Union moving in the early 1940s. And she becomes the vanguard of a large number of Black professionals that move into that neighborhood.
Into Barton Heights.
To Barton Heights, not Highland Park. And that, again, you're looking at neighborhoods that are contiguous to Virginia Union University. So there are a number of really important suburban developments, all now in the city, but all suburban developments of Black neighborhoods, Black subdivisions that were developed in the area around Virginia Union.
So interesting, because it also, as I looked at your slides and you showed that Broad Street area that is just adjacent, I guess it backs up to Jackson Ward, like it's just all boarded up. And yet, like, does Jackson Ward move out to increase Black businesses onto Broad Street, or do we have the gentrification that comes in and pushes?
Well, we're looking at different periods of time. I think what we're looking at is, in the 1950s and 60s with civil rights legislation, the opening of white businesses to Black customers in real ways, that you had this opposite thing that begins to happen in the Black community, where many of the middle-class Black folks moved to Barton Heights, and there's their own there are lots of stories about folks that from Barton Heights that didn't necessarily go to Jackson Ward to shop. They shopped on North Avenue. And so there were these distinct Black retail areas. Another one that's really important that we didn't talk about today was in Church Hill. And so if you go on 25th Street and you go to like 25th and Q and P, that was also another Black retail commercial area of the city, with a whole group of other professional Black folk, doctors, lawyers, that were living in that neighborhood also. So the economic landscape of the city has certainly changed in really interesting ways, both for the Black and white communities. But particularly the 1960s and 70s, the changes in social policy during that period really becomes the basis for what Richmond looks like today, but grounded in the trolleys, these sort of construction of these neighborhoods even further and further out. And I would say that interstate highways are essentially the same thing as trolleys. They basically allow people to move further out and to self-segregate by economics and sometimes by race.
I would say too, I've done a lot of work on like life expectancy and stuff, and you can always see the life expectancy differences by the interstates. It's very, very clear, those differences.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the things that we've seen today, we didn't really spend a lot of time on South Side, but there's some of the areas along the river on South Side, those lush green areas along, or even the Carillon neighborhood. The life expectancy of someone there is 20 years more than someone living in Gilpin Court. It's based on things like shade. We actually have an exhibition at the Valentine right now that one of the pieces of the exhibition looks at the impact of shade and heat, parking lots on health outcomes, and it's pretty profound in Richmond. It's not just about job opportunity. It's actually the long-term health effects of environment, like the access to outdoors and shade and all the other things. So there's those neighborhoods that were redlined after World War II have a combination of factors that is sort of a perfect storm of factors: income, housing inequality, education challenges, environmental challenges, all sort of wrapped into one thing. And we can now see that in pockets that really emerged after the 1950s, but were based on these historical precedents of where people lived.
Kathy, I see yourself off mute. Did you have another follow-up question? Okay, I'll open it up. Do any others have any final comments, questions? Well, again, Belle, thank you so much for engaging us not only in this virtual tour, but a conversation about what history really means. I'm really appreciative. I've learned a ton. I've dropped a few links in the chat for you guys. This is the first event.
You can share the actual presentation if you'd like to share the presentation.
Yeah, we can share it with
because the presentation comes with a map. Take the map out and just drive one day.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the next time we can do this actually on a bus, and we can do this for real. And sorry we had to convert everything to virtual, but I thought today's the day that we really shouldn't be walking around for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and I really appreciate everyone being adaptable and flexible and joining us on this virtual event. A couple of reminders is that we're having a rally towards the future, and it'll be Living Dr. King's Dream this Saturday. I dropped the event in the chat. If you're interested in learning more about the coalition, our Racial Truth and Reconciliation Coalition, or committees, I've also dropped that link, and please make sure you sign up for our listserv so you can be informed about all of these important events that are happening this week. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in other events this week. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you.